So all that raises a few issues for our debate tonight. How much welfare should faith provide? How much should the F factor, the faith factor, be allowed? The row over Catholic adoption agencies was a controversial case of that. And what's really distinctive about faith-based provision? What does the F add? Just recently, there has been quite an explosion of research on this topic, quite a lot of it funded by European bodies, the EU as well. And a few emerging findings strike me as particularly interesting. In relation to the question about what's distinctive in faith-based provision, the answer is it all depends on the relation between state and religion in a particular nation-state setting. And that's a question about how they divided up welfare provision historically. And it varies widely across Europe. Southern Europe is very different from Northern Europe on that, for example. What this means in practice is that faith-based provision tends to plug the gaps in state provision, or to put it more positively, it's complementary to state provision, depending on what kind of state provision there is. And faith-based initiatives often identify new areas of need. They plug the gap in that sense as well. It's not just passive, it's quite active. Another finding, particularly in relation to the UK, is that state provision tends to deal with more acute needs, which may need deep intervention and which are so serious that professional training, expertise, tight regulation and accountability are needed. Some faith-based provision works in this area, but a great deal is less intensive than extensive. For example, sustaining relationships over time with lonely people, with the chronically ill, with people who need lifts to hospital or meals, with those working in the sex industry, dealing with the health needs of first-generation migrants, and so on. That's work which some have called quiet care or slow care. And another thing the research shows is it's massively gendered. Women are preponderant at the point of delivery, not necessarily in the management, but at the point of delivery. This chimes with another finding regarding the distinctive profile of faith-based provision in the UK, which is that there are two categories. There are large, resource-rich professional charitable organisations like the Salvation Army, housing trusts, Jewish Care. And in fact, faith providers are predominant in housing associations and in homelessness provision, as we'll hear about. But there's a second, very different category of many, many small providers, often based around a place of worship, with volunteers doing a lot of this small-scale, quiet care work. And to give you an idea of the massive scale of this, there are roughly 54,000 places of worship in the UK, and some 80 to 90% are doing some sort of welfare work. And there are 24,000 registered religious charities which have a religious profile. That's 1 in 7 of all charities, including some of the largest and some very tiny ones, many tiny ones. Final point from the research, the landscape of faith-based provision has changed dramatically since the 80s in this country in a way which we're only really starting to get to grips with. We tend to think of it just still in terms of the mainline church's work. It's changed in several ways. Non-Christian religions have become big players. Some are very powerful in the local community. We heard about the role of the East London Mosque in an earlier debate. Near me, up in Preston, the Gujarat Hindu Centre plays a similar role, not just for their own members, but widely in the community. Complementary and alternative provision in the well-being and welfare and health sector is a huge growth area as well, which we also haven't paid enough attention to. There's obviously some shrinking in mainline church capacity, but there's also new emerging church initiatives. And of course, note the continuing provision of chaplaincy in prisons, in universities, etc. And then also overall, partly as a result of the government taking faith activities and cohesion more seriously, since the 80s we've got many more interfaith initiatives and linking bodies like the Faith-Based Regeneration Network.
Faith-based organisations, or FBOs as they're commonly known, have always been key players in the provision of services for homeless people. Most of today's homelessness services are, or historically were, affiliated to religious bodies. My study, funded by the Religion and Society programme, explored what, if indeed any difference, the F in FBO makes to what is provided and to how it is provided. Ultimately, my colleagues and I wanted to know, if you're a homeless person using these services, do you, A, notice any difference between faith-based and secular services, and B, care? Do they prefer aspects of faith-based provision or secular provision, and if so, what? That issue aside, our research showed that faith-based homelessness services are not as different from their secular counterparts as is often presumed. Most contemporary secular services actually grew out of faith-based initiatives, and their values are strikingly similar. Furthermore, staff teams in both faith-based and secular agencies almost always contain a mix of people of faith and of no faith, and often from a range of different religious backgrounds. Recent years have witnessed a reduction in the visibility of religion in many FBOs for two reasons. First, a number of commissioners have placed restrictions on the expression of religion. Second, FBOs have, of their own accord, reduced their outward religiosity to avoid appearing unwelcoming to people of another or no faith. Consequently, many of the homeless people we spoke to told us that they find it difficult to discern systematic differences in the quality between faith-based and secular services. Most will tell you that there are no systematic differences in the quality of service provided or the legitimacy of care expressed by staff. In fact, there will often be disagreement amongst users as to whether or not a particular service is or is not religious, and if so, how religious it is. Contrary to what is often presumed, we found that it is the secular agencies which are most sympathetic toward interventionist rehabilitative approaches, with some notable exceptions. Faith-based agencies, on the other hand, tend to favour the non-interventionist, unconditional approaches. These are complex issues, based as they are on different weighting that individuals and agencies accord to welfare and liberty. They are also highly emotive, given the vulnerability of people affected and the potential for interventions to harm rather than, or as well as, help. FBOs are, and will continue to be, central to debates on these issues.
It's not widely recognised just how much New Labour invested in the whole area of faith and welfare, both in terms of policy but also funding. And I undertook a research review for the Department of Communities in 2008, which found that Labour introduced 8 major national initiatives and 10 major funding streams which could be accessed by community-based faith groups, as well as 2 funding streams specifically for faith-based social action. And that report revealed 3 ways in which Labour valued faith. One, as repositories of resources, by which I mean staff, volunteers, networks, buildings and money. And 2, as active citizens, meaning that they volunteer more, they give to charity more, and they even vote more. And 3, as being good at community, and especially at generating social capital, which was important for integration. These funding initiatives were mirrored with governance mechanisms designed to improve faith's participation in civil society. Now, the achievement here was rather more shaky. At national level, the Faith Communities Consultative Council was appointed to advise the Secretary of State for Communities. And though this caused considerable controversy amongst bodies like the National Secular Society and others, in fact it only met twice. I think it's true to say that at government level, New Labour never quite worked out how to engage effectively with religions. But at regional and local level, there was, I think, much more success. Government introduced a local authority duty to consult faith communities in community planning, and places were allocated for faith participation on the regional assemblies. Faith groups were encouraged to take part in things like local strategic partnerships with great effect. Now to the current government's emerging approach to faith and welfare. Well, let me start with the positive. It's fully taken on board, this government, the importance of the faith contribution, and it also wants to deregulate and to leave faiths to do the work in which they're already expert. And all this, of course, fits with the whole idea of smaller state, bigger society. However, let's look more closely at what this means in practice. Above all, government funding is largely being withdrawn.
In spite of these challenges, there's still a clear role for religious organisations in this era of shrinking welfare. Firstly, our churches, communities and charities should act to support people through the significant changes that they're facing. And of particular importance will be assistance for those cut off from their local support networks. This can be undertaken through both professional and informal service, with parishes and other religious communities especially well placed to provide the latter for newcomers to the area. Secondly, advocacy for the poor and vulnerable must remain a priority. Changing societal attitudes towards the unemployed, sick or disabled is an area where we can make a vital contribution through faith schools, youth groups and places of worship, as well as through established charitable organisations. And underscoring all of this should be a continuous reaffirming of inclusive, non-conditional service. Both funders and, more importantly, those we seek to help must be assured that the priority of religious charities and social action projects is not proselytization, but the care and support of the most vulnerable in society, in line with our understanding of our vocation to help those in need.
Alistair Campbell said we didn't do God, but we actually did. We did it like all the good things we did, with a degree of subtlety that nobody noticed. I think that what we're getting to now is a new accommodation. And the new accommodation recognises the critical role that faith has to play. I take up the point that was being made earlier about the nature of the delivery of services. This issue around whether it's done unconditionally or whether it's carried through in a way that seeks to teach a man or woman to fish rather than to giving them the fish. And I think there's a real interesting challenge for faith groups to engage with that debate, because without it, we will end up just shouting from the outside.
My name is Christina Dykes and I work for Dominic Grieve, who's one of the first speakers at another meeting. I have a question about the Near Neighbours scheme. The implication was given that this money was being funneled through the Church of England for some sort of advantage of the Church of England, whereas I understand the involvement of the Church of England is primarily as an administrative process, using its national networks and resources, and that broadly other faiths were appreciative of this. So isn't it better, I put to the panel, that money is administered through a faith-based organisation that is sympathetic to the sector than through the state, which involves, dare I say, all the sins of increased regulation, control and remoteness?
I think we mustn't fall into the trap of believing that there is a model, one which is flexible and non-bureaucratic and reliable, and one that isn't. I think that my experience has been that in the public services run through and funded by government, you can run into the most terrible bureaucracies, and you can also have the most imaginative and innovative programs. And in some charities, not many I've come across, you've had the most incompetent people who didn't really know what they were doing and wasted other people's money and time.
I think that this model poses a risk to the multi-faith paradigm that the previous administration invested so much in, and so did local communities and the regions too. And that risk is that the model that's being posed is one in which people from other faith traditions are being expected to literally queue up for the Anglican vicar's signature for their grant applications. And some may well be relaxed about that, but it's not clear whether they all will be.
Elizabeth Hunter, Director of Theos. I'm interested that all the way through the presentations and the questions, we've been using this word proselytization and proselytizing as if we all know exactly what we're talking about. I don't think you'd find that many religious people who would use that word about a part of their life in general. So I'd like to know, when commissioners think about avoiding proselytizing, what are they specifically thinking of? Where are the lines? Can you put sacred text verses on the walls? Can you leave pamphlets around? And from the position of faith-based organisations, how are they thinking of it? There's a common phrase, preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. So for a lot of them, it's very hard to differentiate between the action that they're undertaking and the witness to their faith.
On proselytization, and I want to say something fairly general about this, which I think the proselytization debate springs from a generalised anxiety about religion in the public sphere. And I think it reflects a muddle and an anxiety because we've lost the ability to talk well about religion in this country, and that's after decades of relativist RE and an ethos of secularist assumptions. I know that's a contested phrase, but we find ourselves alongside that increasingly in encounter with religious plurality and less able actually to converse well about that plurality. So a natural reaction, I think, has been to try to push religion out of the public sphere and just to maintain a nice neutral space. And of course, neutrality isn't possible. Nobody starts from nowhere. There's no such thing as neutrality. And for my part, my personal view is that I think that faith-based social action should absolutely describe itself very clearly in religious terms, if it wants to. I think it's very helpful for it to do that. So that service users and partners and funders and others can hold them to account on those terms, can get very clearly what's the flavour of this service and do I want it or don't I?